God's voice isn't always loud, but it's always present. We often expect God to speak to us in grand, undeniable ways, lightning bolts, audible declarations, or some extraordinary sign that makes it impossible to miss. But more often than not, God's voice comes in a whisper, in the subtle nudges that require us to lean in closer. That's the thing about whispers. They require proximity. God isn't interested in shouting from a distance. He wants intimacy with you. He's not competing with the noise of the world because his voice carries a power that doesn't need to be loud to be transformative. Think about the story of Elijah on Mount Horeb. Elijah was desperate to hear from God, and there was a mighty wind, an earthquake, and a fire, but God wasn't in any of those. Then came a gentle whisper, and that's where God was. That whisper held more power than the elements that could shake the earth because it carried the weight of his presence. This tells us something about the nature of God's communication. He's not always trying to overwhelm your senses. He's trying to engage your spirit. But here's the challenge. We live in a world that celebrates noise. We are conditioned to think that louder means better, that the more dramatic the moment, the more significant the message. Yet God's voice operates on a different frequency. It's not the frequency of chaos. It's the frequency of peace. It's the voice that cuts through the noise, but only if you're willing to quiet yourself enough to hear it. The question isn't whether God is speaking, it's whether we're listening. Sometimes we confuse God's silence for his absence. But silence doesn't mean he's not there. In fact, silence can be one of the most profound ways God speaks. Silence forces us to rely not on what we see or hear, but on what we know to be true about his character. It's in the stillness that our faith is stretched, where we're invited to trust him even when we can't trace him. And then there are times when God's voice is present, but it doesn't align with what we want to hear. We ask for direction, but we don't like the path he points us toward. We want clarity, but his answer comes in the form of a challenge. Sometimes his voice is present in the form of conviction, a nudge that tells us to let go of something we're holding on to too tightly, to step out in faith when we'd rather stay comfortable, or to forgive when our hearts are hardened. His voice might not always affirm your plans, but it will always align with his purpose for you. God's voice can also come through unexpected channels. It might be through a conversation with a friend, a verse you've read 100 times, but suddenly hits differently, or even in the quiet moments when you least expect it. That's the beauty of God's communication. It's creative and intentional. He knows exactly how to get your attention if you're willing to notice. But recognizing God's voice requires practice. It's like tuning a radio. You have to adjust the dial to the right frequency, and sometimes that means removing interference. It might mean stepping away from distractions, spending more time in prayer, or immersing yourself in his word. The more familiar you become with his voice, the easier it is to discern it amidst the noise of life. Distractions often drown out God's whispers. We live in a world that is constantly pulling at our attention. Every second of our day is filled with notifications, deadlines, conversations, and noise. It's not just the physical noise around us, it's the mental noise too. The endless stream of thoughts, worries, and what-ifs that compete for space in our minds. The problem isn't that God isn't speaking. It's that we're often too distracted to hear him. Distractions don't always look like chaos or busyness. Sometimes they show up as the good things in our lives. Our careers, relationships, hobbies, and even ministry can become distractions if they take priority over God's voice. These things aren't inherently bad, but when they dominate our focus, they can drown out the whispers of the one who's trying to guide us. Think about the story of Martha and Mary. Martha was busy with the preparations, doing what seemed important, while Mary sat at Jesus' feet, listening. Martha's busyness wasn't wrong, but it caused her to miss the better thing. Jesus wasn't criticizing her work. He was pointing out that sometimes the most important thing is to stop, be still, and listen. That's a picture of our lives. We're often so busy doing that we forget to be still, be present, and be attentive to God's voice. One of the greatest challenges we face is learning to prioritize the whispers of God over the shouts of the world. The enemy doesn't need to destroy you to derail you. He just needs to distract you. He knows that if he can keep you preoccupied with the temporary, you'll miss the eternal. And distractions don't always come in the form of bad things. Sometimes they're subtle, an overcommitment here, an extra hour of scrolling there, or a constant need to prove yourself. These things chip away at our ability to focus on God, leaving us spiritually drained and disconnected. But distractions aren't just external, they're internal too. How often do we sit down to pray only to have our minds wander to our to-do lists, worries, or insecurities? These internal distractions can be just as powerful as the external ones, keeping us from fully engaging with God. It's like trying to listen to someone speak while your phone keeps buzzing in your pocket. You might hear bits and pieces, but you miss the depth of the conversation. So, how do we combat distractions? It starts with intentionality. We have to create space in our lives where God's voice can be heard. That might mean setting aside time each day for prayer and reflection, turning off our devices, or practicing moments of silence. Silence is uncomfortable for many of us because we're so used to the constant hum of activity, but it's in the silence that we create room for God to speak. Another way to overcome distractions is to be selective about what we allow into our minds and hearts. What we consume, whether it's media, conversations, or even our thoughts, can either amplify God's voice or muffle it. If we fill our minds with negativity, comparison, or fear, it becomes harder to hear the truth of God's word. But when we focus on what is pure, noble, and praiseworthy, we create an environment where his voice can thrive. Distractions also lose their power when we learn to surrender control. Sometimes we're so busy trying to manage everything that we leave no room for God to move. But when we release our need to control every outcome, we free ourselves to hear his guidance. It's in those moments of surrender that his whispers become clear. Ultimately, hearing God requires us to declutter our lives and hearts. It's not about eliminating every distraction, because that's impossible, but about learning to tune in to his voice despite the noise. God's whispers are there, waiting for us to quiet the distractions and listen. God speaks in different ways to reach you where you are. One of the most beautiful things about God is his ability to communicate in ways that are deeply personal and specific to each of us. He knows your personality, your struggles, your strengths, and even your doubts. He doesn't speak to everyone in the same way because he knows that what resonates with one person might not reach another. His love for you is so intimate that he tailors his communication to ensure you can hear him even when you're not actively listening. Sometimes God speaks through his word, the Bible. This is one of the clearest and most consistent ways he communicates. When you open the Bible, you're not just reading words on a page. You're engaging with the living, active voice of God. The scriptures are timeless, yet they have the power to meet you in your current situation. Have you ever read a verse you've seen 100 times, but on this particular day, it feels like it was written just for you? That's God speaking directly to your heart. But God doesn't stop at scripture. He also speaks through people. It could be a sermon that seems to address exactly what you're going through, a conversation with a friend who unknowingly says the words you needed to hear, or even a stranger who offers a kind word that lifts your spirit. God often uses others as vessels to deliver his message. That's why it's so important to surround yourself with people who are also seeking him. The voices you allow into your life can either bring clarity or confusion. Another way God speaks is through circumstances. Sometimes he uses situations, both good and bad, to guide, teach, or get your attention. You might face a closed door and wonder why, only to realize later that God was redirecting you to something better. Or you might find yourself in a challenging season, and though it's painful, you sense God's hand shaping you, strengthening your faith, and drawing you closer to him. Every circumstance, no matter how mundane or extraordinary, carries the potential for God to speak if you're willing to see it that way. God also speaks through creation. The beauty of nature is a reflection of his glory, and it can serve as a powerful reminder of his presence. A sunrise, the sound of waves, or the intricate design of a flower can all point to the Creator. These moments of awe and wonder are his way of whispering, I'm here, I'm with you, I made this for you to see my power and my care. Sometimes God speaks directly to your spirit. It's not an audible voice, but a deep impression in your heart or a sense of peace that surpasses understanding. This inner prompting often comes when you've been seeking him in prayer or when you're in the middle of a decision. You might feel an unexplainable nudge to act, to wait, or to trust. This is the Holy Spirit, God's personal presence within you, guiding and directing you. And then there are the unexpected ways God speaks through dreams, visions, or even moments that seem coincidental but are undeniably orchestrated. These instances remind us that God's methods are limitless. He's not confined by our expectations or logic. He can use anything and anyone to get his message across. The key to recognizing God's voice is to remain open and expectant. If you limit how you think he'll speak, you might miss what he's trying to say. God's voice isn't about volume or method, it's about relationship. He knows exactly what you need to hear and how you need to hear it. Whether it's a verse, a person, a situation, or a still, small whisper in your heart, God is speaking. The question is, are you paying attention? Listening requires faith and action. Hearing God's voice is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when we act on what he says. Listening to God is not a passive experience. It's an active partnership that demands trust, obedience, and courage. It's not just about hearing him, it's about responding to what you hear, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it feels uncomfortable, and even when it requires stepping out of your comfort zone. Faith is the foundation of listening. When God speaks, he often challenges us to trust him in ways that defy logic or our own understanding. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave everything he knew, his home, his security, his family, and go to a land God would show him. There was no roadmap, no GPS, just a promise. Abraham's response required faith, not just to hear God's voice, but to act on it. That's what listening looks like, trusting that God knows what he's doing, even when you don't have all the answers. But let's be honest, listening isn't always easy. Sometimes God's instructions seem too difficult or too vague. You might find yourself saying, God, I need more details, or can you confirm this one more time? It's natural to wrestle with doubt, but faith is about stepping forward even when you're uncertain. God doesn't always give us the full picture because he's more interested in our trust than our understanding. If you wait until everything makes perfect sense, you might miss what God is trying to do through your obedience. Listening also requires intentionality. You can't hear God clearly if you're not actively creating space for his voice in your life, this means setting aside time for prayer, reading his word, and seeking his guidance. It's about tuning out the noise of the world so you can focus on what he's saying. Imagine trying to have a conversation in a crowded room filled with distractions. It's almost impossible to connect. The same is true with God. You have to quiet your heart and make room for him to speak. When you listen to God, it's not just about hearing for yourself. It's about aligning your life with his purpose. God's instructions are rarely just for your benefit. They're often part of a bigger plan that impacts the people around you. Think about Noah. When God told him to build an ark, it wasn't just for Noah's family. It was part of a plan to preserve humanity. Listening to God often means stepping into something greater than yourself, something that will require faith and action on a level you've never experienced before. But here's the thing, listening isn't just about the big moments. Sometimes God speaks in the small, everyday decisions, the ones that seem insignificant but carry eternal weight. It might be the nudge to reach out to someone, to forgive, to take a step of kindness, or to let go of something that's holding you back. These small acts of obedience build a foundation of faith that prepares you for the bigger moments. And let's not forget that listening requires humility. Sometimes what God says isn't what you want to hear. He might call you to wait when you're ready to move, to let go of something you're clinging to, or to take a path that looks harder but leads to greater growth. Listening to God means surrendering your plans and trusting his. It's about saying, God, your will, not mine, even when it costs you something. Finally, listening to God always leads to action. Faith without works is dead, and hearing without doing is incomplete. When you act on God's voice, you demonstrate your trust in him and position yourself to experience his promises. Obedience is the evidence of listening. It's not about perfection, but about a heart willing to say, yes, Lord, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Listening is faith in motion, and it's through that motion that God's purposes are fulfilled in your life. God's voice is often clearest in your moments of weakness. It's in the times when you feel like you have nothing left, when you're at the end of your rope, that God's whispers cut through the noise of life and reach the depths of your heart. Our weakness creates space for his strength to be revealed. When we're strong, self-sufficient, and confident in our abilities, we can mistakenly rely on ourselves instead of leaning on him. Most often, but in weakness, we are reminded of our need for a Savior who not only speaks to us, but carries us through. The Apostle Paul gives us a powerful example of this truth. In 2 Corinthians 12, he talks about the thorn in his flesh, a struggle he prayed for God to remove. But instead of taking it away, God responded with, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That wasn't the answer Paul wanted, but it was the answer he needed. In his weakness, Paul discovered the sufficiency of God's grace and the clarity of God's voice. Sometimes it's not about God removing the struggle. It's about him using the struggle to draw you closer to him. When you're weak, you're more likely to listen. Pain has a way of silencing the distractions and forcing you to confront what truly matters. In moments of heartache, uncertainty, or failure, you often find yourself asking questions you might otherwise ignore. God, where are you? What are you doing? What do you want me to learn? These are the moments when God speaks with clarity because your heart is fully tuned to hear him. God doesn't waste your weakness. He uses it as a platform to reveal his strength, his wisdom, and his plan. When you're at your lowest, he shows up in ways that leave no doubt about his presence. Think about the story of Gideon. He felt inadequate and weak, yet God called him to lead Israel to victory. God intentionally reduced Gideon's army to just 300 men so there would be no confusion about who deserved the credit for the victory. God's voice became clear to Gideon in his weakness, not in his strength. But let's be honest, weakness doesn't feel good. It's uncomfortable, humbling, and often painful. You might wonder why God allows you to go through seasons of weakness in the first place. The truth is, those seasons are opportunities for growth. They strip away the illusion of control and force you to rely on God. Weakness teaches you to depend on Him, to seek His voice, and to trust His plan even when you don't understand it. In your moments of weakness, God often speaks through His word, reminding you of His promises. You might read a verse like Isaiah 41:10. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And suddenly those words come alive in a way they never have before. That's the power of God's voice in your weakness. God also speaks through His peace. When you're weak, anxious, or overwhelmed, His peace has a way of settling over you like a blanket. It doesn't mean the situation changes instantly, but His peace reassures you that He's in control. That peace is His voice saying, I've got this. You don't have to carry it alone. Sometimes God's voice in your weakness comes through others. A friend's encouragement, a timely word from a sermon, or even a kind gesture from a stranger can remind you that God sees you and cares for you. These moments remind you that you're not forgotten, even when you feel invisible. Your weakness is not a barrier to hearing God, it's a gateway. It's in your weakness that His strength is magnified, His voice is amplified, and His presence becomes undeniable. So, if you're in a season of weakness, take heart. God is speaking, and He's using this season to draw you closer, to teach you, and to show you that His power is made perfect in your weakness. Obedience amplifies the clarity of God's voice. God speaks to all of us, but the more we respond to what He says, the more clearly we begin to hear Him. Obedience isn't just about doing what God says, it's about aligning our hearts with His will, even when it's challenging or doesn't make sense in the moment. It's a process of trust, surrender, and faith. And through it, God's voice becomes more recognizable and transformative in our lives. When we choose obedience, we show God that we trust Him, even when we don't fully understand. Think about Peter in the Bible. Jesus told him to cast his net on the other side of the boat after a long, frustrating night, catching nothing. It didn't make sense. Peter was an experienced fisherman, and logic told him it wouldn't work. But he obeyed, saying, because you say so, I will let down the nets. Luke 5, verse 5. The result? An overwhelming catch of fish that Peter could never have imagined. That moment of obedience opened the door for Peter to experience the power and provision of God in a way that transformed his life. Obedience isn't always easy, though. It often requires stepping out in faith, especially when God's instructions seem counterintuitive or uncomfortable. God may call you to forgive someone who hurt you deeply, to give generously when your resources feel limited, or to walk away from something that seems good but isn't aligned with His purpose for your life. These moments of obedience test your faith, but they also deepen your relationship with God. The more you obey, the more you learn to recognize His voice and trust His plans. One of the ways obedience amplifies God's voice is by removing the barriers that block our spiritual hearing. Disobedience creates distance between us and God, not because He stops speaking, but because our hearts become hardened to His voice. When we ignore His guidance, we train ourselves to tune Him out, and over time, it becomes harder to discern what He's saying. But when we choose obedience, we draw closer to Him, and His voice becomes clearer and more distinct. Obedience also creates a ripple effect in your life. When you respond to God's voice, it often leads to blessings and breakthroughs that reinforce your faith and encourage you to keep listening. Consider the story of Joshua and the Israelites at Jericho. God gave them unusual instructions. march around the city for 7 days, and on the seventh day blow trumpets and shout. It sounded illogical, but Joshua obeyed, and the walls of Jericho came crashing down. That act of obedience not only secured victory, but also demonstrated the power of trusting God's voice, even when his commands don't align with human reasoning. But here's the key. Obedience isn't about perfection. It's about willingness. God doesn't expect you to get it right every time. What he desires is a heart that says, yes, Lord, even when it's hard. Obedience is a journey, and each step you take in following God's voice builds your spiritual sensitivity and strengthens your faith. Even small acts of obedience, like choosing to pray when you don't feel like it or stepping out in kindness towards someone, can have a profound impact on your ability to hear God more clearly. Another aspect of obedience is that it often involves waiting. Sometimes God speaks and the action he requires is patience. Waiting can feel like the hardest form of obedience because it goes against our desire for immediate results. But waiting on God is an act of trust, and in that waiting, he works on your heart, prepares your path, and reveals his faithfulness. Finally, obedience positions you to fulfill God's purpose for your life. When you listen and respond to his voice, you align yourself with his plan, and that alignment brings clarity. It's like adjusting a lens to bring a blurry image into focus. As you obey, you begin to see God's hand at work in ways you couldn't before. You realize that his voice isn't just about guiding you, it's about transforming you. So if you want to hear God's voice more clearly, start with obedience. Say yes to the small things, the hard things, and the unexpected things. Trust that his commands are for your good and his glory. And as you obey, watch how his voice becomes clearer, his presence becomes stronger, and his purpose for your life unfolds in ways you never imagined.